Two games to go in this marathon, folks. One is the recently released Devil May Cry 5, which continues the storyline, so to speak, but the other one that came before it was a 2013 reboot of the entire series, a very short-lived rebooted series. Yeah, it's just this one game. Many of you already know why this is, but let's quickly enlighten those that don't. As Devil May Cry 4 hit the stores, meeting with mostly positive feedback, but other action games that released afterwards, like Bayonetta, were accumulating more sales, Capcom decided to take the series in a completely different direction. For some reason, the late 2000s and early 2010s were a strange time in gaming where pretty much everything needed to be rebooted. 2008 had Turok and Alone in the Dark, 2009 had Bionic Commando, 2010 had Medal of Honor, 2011 at the time was Mortal Kombat, 2012 had NFL Blitz, 2013 was like the year of reboots with DmC, Tomb Raider, and SimCity, and 2014 had Thief. Not all of these reboots were bad, but a heavy majority of them couldn't hold a candle to the originals, which is probably why the very idea of even rebooting Devil May Cry didn't go at all well the minute it was announced. First impressions were not great. Fans absolutely despised the look and feel of this game, especially when it came to the redesign for Dante. Instead of a cool, hunky badass like the original games had, this Dante is much younger, scrawnier, and a lot more immature. And I'll admit I did raise an eyebrow after seeing the first trailer for the game. Something about how DmC presented itself rubbed people in all of the wrong ways, to the point where some of the Capcom staff were receiving death threats for even making the game, Jesus. But Capcom stuck to their guns and was very confident in the project when they hired Ninja Theory to develop it. Not to be confused with Team Ninja, who did the Ninja Gaiden and Dead or Alive games. No, it's a British studio that's created a few action titles, but aside from DmC, the one that's probably the most famous of theirs would be Heavenly Sword. I picked this one up for a couple of bucks out of curiosity and in preparation for today's video to give it a quick look. It's an enjoyably average hack and slash title, but man, I forgot how badly some PS3 games run. From the hour and a half or so that I've played, Heavenly Sword also seems to suffer from a lack of identity. I got some 3D Prince of Persia vibes and a lot of God of War vibes, right down to the fixed camera angles, dodging using the right stick, quick time events to kill the bosses, and even the title screen being pretty damn similar. It does throw in a few curveballs to break up the core combat, but I'm sure these have been in other games during that time too. As for DmC, it originally came out on PS3s, Xbox 360s, and PCs, and while the PC version ran fine enough as long as you had the specs for it, the other two versions were not quite as well received graphically, since they ran at 30 frames per second as opposed to the usual 60 frames per second. From what I remember, it was perfectly playable, but I personally feel that you really need to make every frame count when it comes to stylish hack and slashers, so having the smoothest possible gameplay would be most beneficial, which is where the 2015 Definitive Edition comes in for PS4s and Xbox Ones. Not only were the graphics enhanced to 1080p 60 frames per second, but there were new costumes to wear, including previous iterations of Dante in case you're in denial. There are also new gameplay features like a lock-on mechanic in turbo mode. Yeah, I really don't know why those weren't in the original release. And there's the return of Bloody Palace mode, working like it did in Devil May Cry 4, where you move one floor at a time out of 100. The Virgil's Downfall DLC is also added to this edition, which I'll go more into later. So all in all, if you or I are gonna play DmC nowadays, this is the version to look out for. The added stuff may seem small, but it really does make the game more enjoyable for me. But a new take on an old series comes with a new story, so what have we got here? Oh yeah, quick time code before I get started. There you go. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Limbo City. Yeah, I bet you can't guess what the theme's gonna be. Isn't that like naming your town Hellsville? Something about that should be ringing alarm bells. Anyway, in Limbo City, we're introduced to the new Dante as he's getting drunk at nightclubs, lives in a smelly-ass trailer, and takes two girls back with him for a threesome, only to have them leave the following morning. Wow, they are not pulling any punches with him, are they? That's impressive. It must have taken real effort to piss off Dante fanboys in only a few minutes. It's like they were deliberately trying to find every possible way to infuriate them. Sorry, getting ahead of myself. Dante wakes up naked and is approached at the door by Kat, who warns him that he's in danger, as demons are on the hunt for him, and gets dragged into another half of Limbo City in another plane of existence known as, oddly enough, Limbo. I'm not quite sure if it's supposed to be the Limbo we know, cause it certainly looks the part, but being plastered with demons tells me otherwise. It's a world that normal humans can't see anyway, except for Kat because she has psychic powers, but she can't interact with Dante while he's in Limbo, nor can he only interact with her. After some traveling through Limbo and taking down one of the bosses, Dante finds a way back to the human world and follows her to meet her boss, who's in fact Virgil. He explains to Dante that they are of course twin brothers and that he and Kat are part of a rebellion known as the Order, who aim to release humanity from the demon's controls, but are seen as a terrorist group by the police. Virgil also informs Dante that they are part of a race called Nephilim, beings that are born half angel, half demon, the demon half being Sparta as expected, and the angel half being Eva, who's no longer human in this reboot because reasons. Since Dante is the only other Nephilim around apart from Virgil, he requests that Dante joins the Order to destroy all of the demons, including their leader Mundus from the original Devil May Cry, temporarily taken human form. Mundus frequently monitors Limbo City through the use of CCTV cameras and also runs the city's armed police forces, much like the Kingpin in the Marvel Universe. As well as this, Sparta was apparently Mundus' chief lieutenant for the war against the Angels, but with Sparta falling in love with Eva and having twin boys, that was seen as a betrayal to the demons, and thus Sparta was imprisoned to an eternal punishment, giving Dante the rebellion and Virgil the Yamato beforehand, and Mundus killed Eva for good measure by eating her heart. So with that cheerful insight, Dante accepts Virgil's offer to join the Order and take Mundus down. The first order of business is to kill the succubus for making drinks that brainwash the humans, and afterwards you have to kill this news anchor Bob Barbas from smearing Dante's image to make him look like the bad guy, both of which get taken care of in due time, but then Mundus' SWAT team locates the Order's headquarters and shoots everyone on sight. I don't know why we don't get to meet the rest of the Order before they're all axed off, but whatever. Dante has to try and help Kat escape while being in different planes, but after gathering all of the Order's data and saving Virgil, he's told that there's no way to rescue Kat from the SWAT attack despite Dante's efforts. Dante vows to come back for her just as the SWAT team break in, shoot Kat's arm, brutally kick her to the ground, and then drag her back to Mundus. It's one of the few scenes that was actually pretty well done and frankly rather hard to watch. Dante shows a lot more emotion than he usually does during this scene, and with Kat scared out of her mind, it gets pretty intense. So this means an exchange has to be made. Mundus wants Virgil to trade his life for Kat's, but Dante thinks of a better plan by kidnapping and threatening his mistress Lilith, since earlier in the game she and Mundus had a fling and now carries his unborn child. After tackling some of Lilith's challenges in her nightclub and facing her head-on, Dante claims victory and takes Lilith back to HQ to make a counter-offer for Mundus. The day of the exchange arrives and things are going pretty smoothly for a while, but then Virgil decides to shoot and kill the child anyway, caps off Lilith afterwards, and then puts the SWAT team out of their misery because they somehow can't shoot Dante or Kat despite there being way more SWAT recruits than there are the Orders. Seriously, how did these guys keep missing? They're like 10 feet in front of them. Dumbasses. Dante carries Kat back regardless, just as they and Virgil escape the onslaught, and Mundus starts tearing down the city out of rage. However, for some reason that outburst has caused the portal to the demon world within Mundus' stronghold to shrink because attacking the city drained the portal's power or some complicated nonsense like that. All that apparently needs to be done is for Dante and Virgil to infiltrate Mundus' tower, lure him out of the portal, and then close it, leaving the Demon King vulnerable. Mundus then transforms into a giant monster and entraps Virgil, but after a pathetically easy boss fight, Dante lands the final blow and grabs Virgil out before Mundus is dead. Although now Limbo is collapsing into the human world, allowing the humans to see the demons as they spread chaos. And then right the hell out of nowhere, Virgil reveals his true intentions for stopping Mundus. He wants him and Dante to rule this new world where he believes that humans need to be protected because they're idiots that can't fend for themselves, even though Kat has been helping Virgil come this far. Dante disagrees with his plan and tries to talk Virgil out of it, but he's too determined and has no problem fighting his only brother. There's one last climactic sword battle and Dante nearly kills Virgil, but Kat stops him at the last minute, with Virgil departing to another dimension without knowing of his fate. With the world now infested with demons and the city in ruins, that's where the game ends. It just stops. I'm guessing this was supposed to tie into a sequel that never saw the light of day, but that's kind of presumptuous, isn't it? Capcom rebooted one of their most popular series and they didn't take into consideration that not everybody was going to be happy with it. I think they shot themselves in the foot here. But anyway, this is where the Virgil's Downfall DLC begins, but not much really happens here. He has to battle illusions of Dante and Kat, deal with a hollow version of himself, and at one point he actually meets up with Eva, but there's barely a reaction that comes out of him, and she's really upset that Virgil's become such a power-hungry monster. With Virgil taking his mother's disappointment pretty well, he returns to the real world as the demons bow at his presence, becoming the new Demon King with his army of hell. The story is alright in my opinion. I think it's slightly better than the second and fourth games, but it's basically a mix between Devil May Cry 1's story and Devil May Cry 3's. Kill Mundus and then stop Virgil afterwards, which yeah, where did that come from? I know that if you play Devil May Cry 3, then you know that Virgil's gonna be the bad guy, but DmC at no point makes him seem like a villain until this very moment. He made a few stupid choices beforehand, like leaving Kat with the SWAT team, but he never seemed like an intentionally bad person. If he gradually became more more and more persistent on his ideas, then it may have worked a little better, but that's unfortunately not the case. The obvious symbolism is also completely laughable, stuff like showing 666 on beer bottles and Dante and Virgil going through a gateway with the word paradise above it. You get it? Mundus is at least a bit more fleshed out than he was in the original Devil May Cry, even if he is essentially a cartoon antagonist. But the problem with some of DmC's storytelling is that there's a lot of talking and explaining rather than doing compared to the other games. A portion of the cutscenes are just listening to the characters cover the situation and what they should do, which doesn't sound too bad to sit through, but the dialogue isn't exactly Shakespeare, let's just say. Yeah, this script can be absolutely atrocious, even by Capcom's usual silliness. A lot of it isn't the so bad it's good kind either, just plain awful. It feels like a third grader wrote it who's just learning curse words, and no more is this present than with the new Dante. While a perfectly average character in his own right, he doesn't have nearly the same amount of charm as the older Dante, which you can already tell by him confusing swearing with wit. Those are by no means the same thing, and he does it constantly. I'm not gonna act like swearing shouldn't be allowed because I'm just as guilty sometimes, but if you're swearing for no rhyme or reason, you're just coming across as childish. There's a time and a place for that sort of thing, that's all I'm saying. Though admittedly, this scene here had hints of old Dante that I quite liked.
You're not on the list. And now.
Okay, yeah, just take out the swearing and it'd be fairly close. So the story was kind of hit and miss overall. Entertaining enough, sure, but it's one of the things people immediately point to when they say they don't like DmC. But how does the gameplay differ from past entries? Well, actually, there isn't a huge difference when it comes to DmC's combat system, but there are a couple of things that make it stand out from the rest. Firstly, though, I would recommend switching Turbo mode on if you're playing the Definitive Edition. The default speed is perfectly fine, but the increase really does make it better. Hack and slashing in this game is sort of like a combination of Dante's signature moves, while also borrowing a few elements from Nero in Devil May Cry 4. The Rebellion as well as Ebony and Ivory work pretty much exactly as they did in the 3rd and 4th games, but very shortly into DmC you'll be able to grapple enemies towards you and you towards the enemies. There's a dodge button that you can use also, which seems like a much welcomed addition, but with how the previous games have trained me, I never really use it. Devil Trigger comes back once more after a certain point in the game, acting like it normally does, except time stops and enemies float in the air. Upgrades are once again bought at Divinity statues or just before starting a mission, but this time you can only buy one at a time after accumulating a certain amount of experience points depending on your stylish rank. And just like Devil May Cry 4, red orbs are used to buy items as well as health and Devil Trigger upgrades, though red orbs are a lot stingier than the other games, just keep that in mind. But perhaps the most unique change to the combat is switching weapons more easily by holding the triggers. The left trigger for the Angel Blue crowd control weapons, and the right trigger for the slower but hard-hitting Demon Red weapons, with specific weapons being more effective against enemies with the same color. Not an entirely new concept in Ninja Theory, as they use this exact same setup in Heavenly Sword. It was probably one of the only things about it that set it apart from other action titles. Being able to swap to another weapon and back so smoothly in the middle of your combo is a rather ingenious idea, but this does however make it far less comfortable to dodge or lock onto an enemy, since that means you have to hold both a bumper button and a trigger button. It's most likely why I often forget about the dodge button and just jump past incoming attacks. I do quite like these new weapons though. You're only allowed to carry one on each trigger, and the fist option in this game could maybe be a little more powerful, but you can easily switch them out by pressing left or right on the D-pad. There's a great satisfaction to be had when I'm pulling an enemy towards me, mixing the quick combos from the Rebellion, immediately changing to a wider attack area with Osiris or Aquila, and then finishing off with a slam to the ground using Eric's or Arbiter. With these options at your disposal, DmC can become one of the easier games in the series to master and keep the stylish rank going. This does not only come at the cost of no longer having different styles to play around with, but you also have a pitiful amount of guns to choose from. You've got Ebony and Ivory at the start of the game, still just as awesome as they've ever been, but then about 2/3 into the adventure, you finally get your next weapon, the shotgun, which would have been nicer to have way earlier, and the only other gun you get afterwards is Kablooey. Love the name, but damn is it useless. You shoot explosive darts into enemies and detonate them whenever you want to. It's not quick or practical enough for my liking. The pacing can also be a bit slow during the first third of the game. You'll be spending a lot of time platforming, grappling more platforms, and trudging through these urban environments. By the time you start going after the succubus, however, that's where the game starts picking up in my opinion. Though saying that, DmC also likes to be more cinematic than the other games times because some stages have scripted or time-sensitive sequences, or a couple of times you'll just be running and talking with Cat while performing the occasional action. That can drag the pacing back down sometimes. At least they're brief, and in the game's defense, some parts of Limbo do look quite nice, particularly the floating islands and when the game decides to change things up a bit, like at Lilith's nightclub or the Raptor News Network that's just one giant ident. Those were some of the best levels of the game for me, followed by some really unique boss fights. But oh boy, while these bosses certainly look threatening, they are an absolute cakewalk to defeat. They're still fun, but the weak spots are incredibly obvious and they'll be staggered for God knows how long for you to attack them. The penultimate boss especially was an utter joke. Very disappointing after all the build-up leading to it. I only struggled with the final boss, and even then it was just during the last phase. Otherwise, these foes won't provide much of a challenge, a little sad to say, honestly. Design-wise, at least, they're very creative. I can't say I've ever seen a succubus like this, and for God's sake, there's a boss fight against the virtual head of a news anchor, and another one with a giant infant that comes out of its mother and is somehow less creepy than the giant baby in Catherine. Well, the bosses are interesting, but I gotta say some enemies can be freaking irritating. Mostly the ones that take major damage to the corresponding weapons. And if those same enemies are grouped up together, that's when the combat starts getting messy. I had this one secret mission that took me half an hour to do because there were two of the strongest enemies in the game, each with separate weaknesses, and another one shooting deadly projectiles and has a shield surrounding it and can even put that shield on one of the other enemies. This was a pain to finish and one of the worst secret missions I've played in this series so far. Though speaking of secret missions, they are a little easier to find this time around, as they're now behind these giant golden doors, but that also means you have to search for a hidden key in the level to gain access. They can be a little tricky to find, and I usually discover a lost soul instead that's just there to unlock concept art, but I don't like how some of them can only be obtained via New Game Plus, and that's if you choose the right path without continuing the story and preventing you from going back. That quite sucks. I guess all that's left to talk about is the Virgil's Downfall DLC. As expected, you play as Virgil for a short adventure that lasts less than 2 hours, with some of the same abilities that he had in Devil May Cry 3 and 4, with a few new ones added. Like Dante, Virgil also has a couple of extra melee weapons dedicated to each trigger, and instead of a traditional devil trigger, his spinning blades and doppelganger can be called upon, but drains a chunk of the meter. You might want to use them as often as you can, because this DLC loves to throw every possible enemy in your way. Some hordes of enemies can go on for a really long time, but still the one boss fight in the entire campaign is pathetically easy. Virgil's way slower than Dante as well, even with turbo mode on. I don't even know how that's possible, and I managed to get a triple S rank on my first try. That's never happened to me before. The art style for the cutscenes are pretty cool though. Not sure why Ninja Theory went in this direction, but they're stylized enough so I have no problem with it. Virgil's Downfall as a whole is an okay time, but not nearly as in-depth as Dante's campaign. I don't see myself going back to it for a while, maybe if I've done everything I can in the core game and cleared the Bloody Palace. That's pretty much all I've got to say about DmC, and it's really not that bad. I don't see it as an absolute blight on humanity like others seem to think it is. I mean, I can understand why the initial idea could be upsetting, but at its worst, it's still a good enough Devil May Cry game. I personally enjoy DmC more than other games in the series like Devil May Cry 2 and 4 because it tries to do something different and the speedy combat is a lot of fun, even if the toughest enemies do ruin it. Is it the best Devil May Cry game? No, but it's still good just on its own. I think I am glad that a sequel never got made for this because I don't know how it could have worked stretched out as a separate series without feeling repetitive like how the Tomb Raider Origins trilogy suffered. DmC is probably best as a self-contained title, nothing more. Like I said earlier, if you are going to play DmC these days, you're better off getting the definitive edition on PS4 or Xbox One with turbo mode, the lock-on mechanic, and all the added content included. The writing can be a little juvenile at times, but I'd say give DmC a chance for a more modern take on fun hack and slashing. Well, that just leaves one more game to go, the latest one in the lineup, Devil May Cry 5, a return to the original series, but is that a good thing or a bad thing? We'll go over that after the next video, which I think I'll do Bloodstained Curse on the Moon to make up for not doing Ritual of the Night just yet. I really hope those Switch updates come soon. See you all later, and take care. Entertaining enough, sure, but... I forgot my line. Blight on humanity like others seem to think it is.